Well, good evening, my four little Vermeulen grands. It's so good to see you. First of all, we're going to dedicate these readings to a very special person in our life, and that is Uncle Hoon. He's the one that got us started on this idea when he read to his kids. He missed his kids in school, and so he decided that he was going to read them a very special book. That's how this idea came to be. First of all, I wanted to find a book that all of you would like, which is kind of hard because you go from 10 to 4. So I looked on the internet and I couldn't find anything that was really great. So then I thought, why not go up into our attic? We have a whole treasure of books up there that belong to Uncle Hoon and to your dad. So Grandma went all the way up the stairs and pushed that big heavy door open, and I climbed up into that hole, and there in front of my eyes was a treasure. There were books everywhere. So I started looking through. The first one I came to was a big book called Big Boo. It was one of Uncle Hoon's favorite books. Then I thought, nah, I really want to get one that your dad liked. So I kept looking. All of a sudden I found this book. It's called Bunnicula. I knew, I could vaguely remember that your dad used to love that book. He used to sleep with it at night. So I texted your dad and I said, hey, do you remember a little book called Bunnicula that you used to like? I'm thinking about reading this to the kiddos. He went, oh, I sure do. I remember that little red-eyed devil. I went, red-eyed devil? Oh no, I don't know if this book will be appropriate. So I decided I would read it myself. I think you're going to enjoy it. First, we just need a little bit of background. I think we all know what vampires are, especially around Halloween. We see them everywhere. They wear the big black capes. They have the white pointed teeth. And we know that they originated in a place called Transylvania. We know that they sleep at night. They sleep during the day. They don't sleep at night. Night is when they're up. Sunlight destroys them, so they hunt at night and they sleep during the day. And we all know that their favorite food is blood. In our book, we have 3 main characters. We have Chester the cat. That's easy to remember because if you remember the Cheshire cat from Alice in Wonderland. And then we have Harold the dog. I don't think your Grandpa Harold will be too offended if he looked this cute. So that's how we will remember his name, Harold. And then, of course, we have this little creature whose name is Bunnicula. Okay? This story is told from the point of view of Harold. The dog is telling the story. It starts out with an editor's note, kind of explaining to us how the story begins. The book you are about to read was brought to my attention in a most unusual way. One Friday afternoon, just before closing time, I heard a scratching sound at the front door. When I opened the door, there before me stood a sad, droopy-eared dog carrying a large plain envelope in his mouth. He dropped it at my feet, gave me a soulful glance with great quiet dignity. Then he sauntered away. Inside the envelope was the manuscript of the book that I now hold in my hands. Inside, the letter read, Gentlemen, the enclosed story is true. It happened in this very town, to me and the family with whom I reside. I have changed the name of the family in order to protect them, but in all other respects, everything you read here will be factual. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Harold. I come to writing purely by chance. My full-time occupation is dog. I live with Mr. and Mrs. X, called here the Monroes. Their two sons, Toby, aged 8, and Pete, aged 10. What a coincidence. Also sharing our home is a cat named Chester, whom I am pleased to call my friend. We were a typical American family. We still are, though the events related in my story have, of course, had their effect on our lives. I hope you will find this tale of sufficient interest to yourself and your readers to warrant its publication. Sincerely, Harold X. So Harold is telling the story. The Arrival. I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house till they returned. That's something they always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold. You're the watchdog. I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them. As if I wanted to go with them. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen. And people think that you're being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore, or you scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rug in front of a nice, warm fire. But I digress. I was talking about that first night. Well, it was cold. The rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be inside. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chester was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd staked out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair. I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow. Next to grasshoppers, there is nothing that frightens Chester more than the vacuum cleaner. Well, in the midst of all this, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Monroes, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby, Pete, Mom, and Dad. There was a flash of lightning, and in its glare, I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a little bundle, a bundle with tiny, glistening eyes. Peter and Toby bounded into the room, talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad." "Take your boots off," their mother replied. "You're soaking wet." She said that somewhat calmly under the circumstances. "But Mom, what about the—" "First, stop dripping on the carpet." Would somebody like to take this?" asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle. "I'd like to remove my coat." "I will," yelled Peter. "No, I will," said Toby. "I found him." "You'll drop him." "I will not." "You will too." "Mom, Pete punched me." "I will take him," said Mrs. Monroe. "Now take your wet coats off." But because she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coats, she didn't take the bunny at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hi to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. "Harold!" cried Toby. "Guess what happened?" And then all over again, everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something. In our family, everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as people. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never just, "Good boy, Harold," or "Use the litter box, Chester." Not at our house. It's always, "Hey, Harold, Dad got a raise. Now we're in a higher tax bracket." Or, "Come sit on the bed, Chester. Watch this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you'll see a relative." Which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor, and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer. So we think of it as a rather special household. We are, therefore, rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with the glistening eyes, now looking at us. It seems that they had arrived at the theater late. Rather than trip over the feet of the audience that was already seated, they decided to sit in the last row because it was empty. They tiptoed in and they sat down very quietly so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed. He sat on something. Mr. Monroe told him to stop making a fuss, move to another seat. But in an unusual display of independence, Toby said he wanted to see just what he had sat on. An usher came over to the row to shush them. Mr. Monroe borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was a little blanketed bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Monroe's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit sitting in a shoebox. A piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the Monroes were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved closer for a better look. Now, most people might call me a mongrel, but I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and Russian wolfhound happened to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian mountain region. Roughly translated, the message read, "Take good care of my baby." But I couldn't tell if it was a note from a bereaved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Monroe and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. For the night, the boys would make a bed for him in the shoebox. Toby and Pete ran outside to find the crate. Mrs. Monroe went to the kitchen to get some milk and lettuce. Mr. Monroe sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chester, and the two of us casually moseyed over to a corner of the room, and we looked at each other. "What do you think?" I asked. "I don't think rabbits like milk," he answered. Chester and I were unable to continue our conversation because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Mom, Toby broke the rabbit's house!" Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma, Toby broke the rabbit's house!" "No, I didn't. I just dropped it. Pete won't let me carry it. It's too big and Toby's too little." "I am not." "You are too." "Okay, fellas," Mrs. Monroe called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. "Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible, please." Chester turned to me and said under his breath, "That lettuce looks repulsive, but if there's any milk left, I get it." I certainly wasn't going to argue with a cat. I'm a waterman myself. And at that moment, the crate arrived, barely standing the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. Ma, Toby said he's not going to keep the rabbit in his room, or he is going to keep the rabbit in his room. That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room now. Only sometimes, I thought, when I know he's got a leftover ham sandwich in his drawer. Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't hurt that he shares his stash with me. It was, after all, at one of those late-night parties in Toby's room that I, Harold, first developed my taste for chocolate cake. Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Good kid. Pete, on the other hand, does not believe in sharing. The only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pinned my ears so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crick in my neck for days. But he's mine, Toby said. I found him. You sat on him, you mean? I found him, and he's sleeping in my room. You can keep smelly old Harold in your room, and Chester too if you want to, but I'm going to keep the rabbit in mine. Smelly old Harold? I would have bitten his ankle, but I knew he hadn't changed his sock for a week. Smelly indeed. Mr. Monroe spoke up. I think the best place for the rabbit is right here in the living room, on that table by the window. It's light there, and he'll get lots of fresh air. Pete's taller than I am, Toby cried. He'll be able to see the rabbit better. Too bad, Squirt. Okay, said Mrs. Monroe. Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable. Then we can all get some sleep. Why? I don't want to go to sleep, Pete asked. Mrs. Monroe smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. Look, Ma, said Toby. He's not drinking his milk. Chester nudged me in the ribs. Didn't I tell ya? Excuse me while I make myself available. Hey, said Toby. We gotta name him. Can't that wait till tomorrow? Asked Mr. Monroe. The boys shouted in unison. No, he has to have a name right now. I have to say I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the 3 most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were going to call me Fluffy, as Mrs. Monroe had suggested. Well, all right, sighed Mrs. Monroe. What about Bun Bun? Oh, there she goes again, I thought. Where does she get those names? Yuck, we all said. Well then, how about Fluffy? Peter looked at his mother and smiled. You never do give up, do you, Mom? Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Monroe's ankles and purring loudly. Not now, Chester, not now, she said, pushing him aside. He wants to help us name him, don't you, Chester? Toby asked as he scooped him up into his arms. Chester shot me a look. I could tell this is not what he had in mind. Come on, Harold, Toby called. You've got to help with the name, too. I joined the family and seriously started thinking. We all peered in the box. It was the first time I had really seen him. So this is Rabbit, I thought. He sort of looks like Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail and a motor in his nose. Well, said Pete after a moment, since we found him at the movies, why don't we call him Mr. Johnson? Who's Mr. Johnson? Asked Toby. The guy who owns the movie theater, Pete answered. No one seemed to like that idea. Well, said Mr. Monroe, how about Prince? Dad, are you kidding? Well, I had a dog named Prince once. Prince, I thought. That's a silly name for a dog. We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula. That's a stupid name, said Pete. No, it's not. Anyway, I found him, so I should be able to get to name him. Mom, you're not going to let him name him, are you? That's favoritism. I'll be traumatized if you do. Mrs. Monroe looked in wonder at Pete. Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula, cried Toby. Please, please, please. And with each please, he squeezed Chester a little harder. Mrs. Monroe picked up the bowl of milk and moved toward the kitchen. Chester followed her every movement with his eyes. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, "Let's not have any more arguments. We shall compromise. He's a bunny. We found him at a Dracula movie, so we shall call him Bunnicula. That should make everybody happy, including me." "What about me?" muttered Chester. "I won't be happy till she puts that milk down." Well, guys, that okay with you? Toby and Pete looked at one another, then at the rabbit. A smile grew on Toby's face. "Yeah, Ma, I think that name is just right." Pete shrugged. "Okay, but I get to feed him." "Okay, I'm going to put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he'll drink it tomorrow." "What about Chester?" Toby said. "Maybe he would like the milk." Chester made a beeline for Mrs. Monroe, and he looked up at her plaintively. "Oh, Chester doesn't want any more milk, do you, Chester? You've already had your milk today." She reached down, patted Chester on his head, and walked into the kitchen. Chester did not move. "Okay, bedtime," said Mr. Monroe. "Good night, Bunnicula," Tony said. "Good night, Count Bunnicula," Peter said sarcastically, in what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. "Good night, Harold." "Good night, Chester." And I licked Toby good night. "Good night, Smelly Harold." "Good night, Dumb Chester." I drooled on Pete's foot. "Mom, Harold drooled on my foot." "Good night, Peter," Mrs. Monroe said with great finality as she came back into the living room. "Good night, Harold." "Good night, Chester." And Mr. and Mrs. Monroe went up the stairs together. "You know, dear," Mr. Monroe said, "that was very clever. Bunnicula. I never could have thought of a name like that." "Oh, I don't know, Robert. I think Prince is a lovely name, too." The room was quiet. Chester was still sitting by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly he turned to me. "I wish they had named him Fluffy," was all he said. And of course, Chester was very upset because he did not get the leftover milk. That is the end of chapter 1. We will try to read chapter 2 tomorrow. I don't know because Grandma and Grandma will be at camp. I don't know if we have the ability to do that, but I will try. If not, I will let your mom and dad know when the next reading will be. The next reading, I think you should all be snuggled up on the sofa in the den with your jammies on, your baths done, your hair combed, and your teeth brushed. I love you, kiddos.